The applause in the Galactic Senate chamber sounded like 1,000 different things dying at once. The Veth delegates shimmered in pale gold. The Drache clicked their approval through hollow chest cavities. The Nureli hummed in frequencies that rattled my back teeth. Every species in that hall celebrated the same way they always had when a younger race finally bent the knee, loud, self-congratulatory, and completely sure of themselves. I stood at the podium and kept my face like a closed door. "The Terran delegation formally accepts Resolution 7 Omega," I said. "Humanity will comply with all disarmament conditions as outlined. Full decommission of offensive military assets within 18 planetary cycles. Inspection access granted. We thank the Senate for its guidance." I straightened the corner of my translation earpiece, just the corner, then again. The Veth High Arbiter, Counselor Voshen, leaned forward from his elevated seat with that particular tilt of his long neck that I had learned meant satisfaction. He had the look of a man who had just sorted a problem into the correct drawer. Humans had been the open file on his desk for 11 years. Now, apparently, we were filed. "Commander Osai Mensa," he said, his translated voice arriving a half-second after his mouth moved. "The Senate recognizes the maturity of the Terran response. We have guided many species through this transition. It is never easy, but it is always correct." "Of course," I said. I straightened the earpiece again. I had been in this chamber 14 times over 4 years. I had watched the Senate process 3 other species through resolutions similar to 7 Omega. The Caliph had wept publicly. Their lead delegate had delivered a 40-minute speech about heritage and sacrifice. The Senate had listened politely and stripped them down to a planetary defense grid and a small ceremonial fleet. The Yuri had protested through legal channels for 8 cycles before quietly surrendering their warships one by one, each decommissioning broadcast live on Senate feeds like a kind of slow funeral. Humanity had done neither. Humanity had read the resolution, reviewed it for 72 hours, and responded with a simple written acceptance. No speeches, no legal challenges, no visible grief. That, I knew, was what made Voshen the most comfortable. Simple compliance read as submission, submission read as safety, and safety meant the Senate could stop watching quite so carefully. We had been counting on that. I stepped down from the podium and walked the long floor of the chamber toward the Terran delegation box, where my aide, a young man named Colin Graves, stood with his hands behind his back and his expression professionally blank. He had been with me for 2 years, long enough to know how to stand in rooms like this one, long enough to know when not to speak. I sat. He sat beside me. The chamber continued its business. 3 more resolutions on trade lanes, 1 on resource extraction rights in the Balan system, nothing that required my attention. My comm unit buzzed once against my wrist. I did not look at it immediately. That was important. I had learned years ago that the way a person reacts to a message in a room full of people watching them is itself a form of language. So I waded through the trade lane discussion. I waded through the Balan extraction vote. I straightened my earpiece one more time. Then I looked. The message was from Admiral Grace Nkosi, Earth Command Central. Timestamp: 4 hours ago, sent the moment the Senate vote had confirmed. 3 words. I read them once, looked up at the chamber ceiling, pale blue, designed to be calming to as many species as possible, a committee decision that had resulted in something that looked like the inside of a corporate waiting room. Read them again. Colin, without looking at me, passed me a small cup of coffee from the delegation flask. He had no way of knowing I needed it. He had brought it anyway. That was the thing about good aides. They worked on instinct. I drank it. Voshen caught my eye from across the chamber and gave a slow, gracious nod. The nod of a man who believed the hard part was over. I nodded back. I put the comm unit face down on the desk. Around me, the Senate celebrated its tidiness, its resolution, Its clean management of a species that had, for the past century, made every senior diplomat in the galaxy deeply, quietly nervous. Humanity, with its irrational endurance, its bizarre emotional architecture, its habit of fighting past every rational stopping point, was now disarming, laying down, becoming manageable. The Veth ambassador to my left leaned over with the particular warmth of someone extending an olive branch they believe costs them nothing. "I hope," he said, "that your people understand this is not defeat. It is simply the natural order. Every species finds its place." "We understand completely," I said. He smiled, warm, generous, sure. I smiled back. It did not reach my eyes. It was not supposed to. The chamber doors behind me were 8 meters tall, etched with the seals of every Senate member species, over 200 of them, going back 3,000 years. I had stood in front of those doors the first time I came to this chamber as a junior attaché, 26 years old, barely cleared for the room, craning my neck to find the Terran seal among the hundreds of others. It was near the bottom. New members always were. Colin leaned close and spoke quietly. "The transport back to the Terran station departs in 40 minutes. I know. Do you need anything before we go?" I looked at the 3 words on my comm screen one more time. Then I locked it and stood, gathering my documents with the unhurried movements of a woman with nothing left to do here. "No," I said, "we're done." I walked out of the chamber. Behind me, the Senate was still applauding something. I did not turn around to see what. On the transport, Colin sat across from me with a data tablet and the careful silence of someone who had been told, in no uncertain terms, that certain things were not discussed on Senate-monitored transports. He worked. I watched the station shrink through the viewport, that enormous pale structure, confident and self-satisfied, orbiting its star like a crown. I thought about those 3 words. I thought about the warehouses on Earth and the 4 moons, and the deep installations on Titan that the inspection teams would never locate, because they were not looking for the right shape of thing. I thought about 18 planetary cycles, and what a species could do in that time if it had been preparing for 11 years before the clock even started. The transport accelerated, the station disappeared. I straightened the corner of my earpiece. The Veth ambassador had mistaken my smile for warmth. He would not be the last to make that mistake, but he would, eventually, understand what it actually was. Not warmth, not submission, something older than both. The first inspection team arrived on a Tuesday. I know that detail is meaningless to anyone not from Earth. Tuesday is a Terran calendar artifact, a leftover from a timekeeping system built around a single star and a single moon, and a civilization that once thought those were the only things worth measuring. But I was born on a Tuesday, in a government hospital in Accra, during a thunderstorm that knocked out half the city's grid. My mother had always said the lights came back on exactly when I did. I thought about that while I watched the Senate inspection shuttle descend through the cloud cover over the Nevada installation, its lights blinking in the gray morning like something that believed it was welcome. Chief Inspector Lanvor was Veth, mid-ranking, selected specifically because he had processed 3 other disarmament protocols and was known for his thoroughness. The Senate had told us this in advance. Transparency, they called it. We had smiled and said thank you. I met him on the landing pad with an umbrella and a thermos of coffee. "Commander." He stepped out of the shuttle with his documentation assistant and 2 junior inspectors who had the wide-eyed look of recent graduates seeing their first non-Senate world. "We appreciate the Terran cooperation." "Of course," I said, "coffee." He looked at the thermos with the polite confusion of a species that processed nutrients through membrane absorption. "I am not able to consume that." "I know," I said. "I offer it anyway, it's a human thing." I poured myself a cup. He watched me with his large amber eyes and then, diplomatically, said nothing about it. The Nevada installation was the first on the inspection list. 300 decommissioned combat vehicles, cataloged by type, stripped of power cores, arranged in neat rows under covered bays. Landvor walked through them with his scanner raised, reading the serial numbers, cross-referencing against the weapons registry that Earth Command had submitted to the Senate 6 weeks prior. Everything matched. That was important. Everything was supposed to match, because everything in this building was real. These were genuinely decommissioned vehicles. Their power cores were genuinely removed. The documentation was genuinely accurate. Colin walked 3 steps behind me, holding the secondary manifest with both hands. His face was a professional wall. He had been briefed. He knew the shape of what we were doing here. The inspection took 4 hours. Landvor was thorough, as advertised. He checked serial numbers against manifest records. He scanned for residual energy signatures. He measured the dust accumulation patterns on the vehicle surfaces to verify they had been sitting inactive for the claimed duration. They had been. We had made sure of it. Bay 7, one of his junior inspectors said, looking up from his scanner. I'm reading an anomalous structural signature through the north wall. Landvor looked at me. Adjacent storage facility, I said. Not on your inspection list, different classification. The resolution grants full access to all military storage. Of course, I said. I'll need to submit a reclassification request to the Senate Oversight Bureau before I can authorize entry. Standard protocol. Should take about 6 days. He looked at his junior inspector, then back at me. We can wait, he said. Excellent, I said. More coffee. He did not want more coffee. He did not want any coffee, but I poured myself another cup because it gave my hands something to do. The reclassification came through in 4 days, not 6. We took him to Bay 7. It was full of farming equipment. Not metaphorically, not cleverly disguised farming equipment with hidden components and secondary functions. Actual, functional, certified agricultural machinery, soil processors, seed distribution arrays, atmospheric moisture collectors. The kind of equipment that had been donated to the Terran Colonial Agricultural Program 3 years ago and was awaiting transport to the outer settlements. Landvor stood in the middle of it for a long time. This triggered your anomalous reading, I said helpfully, because the moisture collectors have a metallic composite casing that registers on standard military scanners. Known issue. The manufacturer has a note about it in the technical documentation. I handed him a physical copy, tabbed to the relevant page. He took it, read it, looked at the rows of soil processors, looked at me. You kept us waiting 4 days for farming equipment, he said. Protocol, I said. I can't selectively skip steps. It would set a bad precedent. He looked at the equipment for another long moment. I would like coffee, he said. I poured him a cup. He could not drink it, but he held it, and I thought that was interesting. We moved through 14 installations over the next 22 days. Warships, cataloged and inert, their hulls intact but their cores dark. Artillery platforms decommissioned and logged. Defense satellites photographed and numbered, their targeting systems wiped to Senate-verifiable 0. The numbers were stunning, honestly. Even I, who had been living inside the data for years, felt something when I saw it laid out across Landvor's inspection tablets. Humanity had been building for a century. The sheer volume of what we were surrendering was significant. Landvor commented on it, on day 16, standing in front of a row of deep space frigates in the lunar dock. Your species built considerable capacity, he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. We had a difficult first century of contact, I said. He made a notation in his tablet. These vessels, their crews. Reassigned, I said. To what? Colonial support roles, medical transport, infrastructure development. He looked at the ships, Long dark bodies, 12 in a row, their names still painted on their hulls in white letters. Good ships, ships that had kept a lot of people alive. I had served on one of them briefly, a long time ago. I looked at its name and then looked away. They were well maintained, Lanvor said, almost to himself. Yes, I said. He made another notation. On the final day of the primary inspection sweep, he submitted his preliminary report to the Senate, Terran disarmament proceeding in verifiable compliance with Resolution 7 Omega. No significant violations. No concealed assets detected. Colin handed me the summary on a tablet. I read it in the transport back to the Terran station. Outside the viewport, Earth turned below us, blue and white and brown, entirely ordinary looking. A planet that had just handed over enough firepower to level a solar system, and done it with paperwork and cups of coffee and the calm of a species with absolutely nothing to hide. I set the tablet down. Lanvor had missed 23 things. He had been precise, diligent, experienced, and he had missed 23 things because they were not shaped like the things he was looking for. I had been counting. I kept the number in my head, where it sat warm and exact. Compliance verified. I framed the commendation the Senate sent the following week, seemed polite. 6 months after the Senate declared humanity in full compliance with Resolution 7 Omega, the Dracha hit Kepler 442. Nobody was surprised, not on our side. The Dracha were a species with a long institutional memory for opportunity. They had watched the Caliph get stripped down and absorbed 3 decades ago. They had watched the Yuri lose their deep space capacity, and then watched Dracha merchant fleets quietly expand into corridors the Yuri used to patrol. They understood how disarmament worked. They understood what a newly compliant species looked like from the outside: soft edges, clear lanes, no consequence. Kepler 442 was a human colony. Small, about 4,000 people, an agricultural and light manufacturing settlement on the third planet of a yellow dwarf star, 12 light-years from Earth's nearest military installation. Or, at least, 12 light-years from what the Senate believed was Earth's nearest military installation. The Dracha task force entered the system at 3:40 station time. 7 vessels. Not their full fleet, they were not taking any real risk. This was a demonstration, the kind of entry move that said, the old order has changed and we are here to establish terms. I was in my office at the Terran diplomatic station when the alert came in. I was filling out Form 7C, a Senate Resource Declaration update that needed to be submitted by end of cycle. I kept filling it out. My secondary screen showed the Dracha fleet's position, updated every 40 seconds from a relay I was not technically supposed to have. I kept filling out the form. The Dracha made contact with orbital communication relay at 3:47. They transmitted a standard territorial claim notice, a legal document, technically, the kind that gave the appearance of process while meaning exactly nothing. The colony would have 48 hours to acknowledge Dracha authority before the administrative transition began. They did not receive a response. They tried again at 3:52. The colony's communication relay had gone silent, not jammed, not destroyed, silent. The way a building goes silent when everyone in it has simply left. Colin came into my office at 4:01. He set a cup of coffee on the corner of my desk, well away from my paperwork, and sat down across from me without being asked. Dracha are scanning the third planet, he said. I know. They're not finding what they expected. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the office window, the station's habitation ring curved away into artificial light, other offices, other people working at other things. What are they finding? He asked. I saved my progress on Form 7C, closed it, opened it again because I had saved to the wrong folder, moved it to the correct folder, closed it again. Do you remember? I said. "The agricultural equipment in Bay 7. He looked at me for a long moment. "Moisture collectors," he said slowly. "Among other things," I said. The Dracha task force spent 6 hours in the Kepler 442 system. During that time, they scanned the third planet thoroughly. They found a colony that had, by all appearances, been evacuated, not under fire, not in panic, but cleanly, efficiently, with no abandoned vehicles or personal items, which was its own kind of strange. They found agricultural infrastructure spread across a wide area, which matched the colony's listed economic activity. They also found 17 other things that did not match any entry in their military recognition database. Because those things had never been formally classified as military in any Senate document, because the Senate had only ever asked humanity to surrender what was already categorized, and the categorization process had been handled 4 years ago by a small team that I had personally supervised. The Dracha lead commander made the decision to transmit a direct territorial challenge at 9:44. The challenge was received. The response came in 11 minutes. I did not watch the engagement feeds. I had the data. I knew what had been deployed where in what configuration. I did not need to watch. What I had instead was the record of what the Dracha transmitted back to Senate space at 10:31 station time. A single communication, marked urgent, addressed to the Galactic Senate open floor. It was 2 sentences. Colin read it first. He set the tablet down on my desk with the careful movement of someone setting down something unexpectedly heavy. I read it. The first sentence was a formal withdrawal of the territorial claim on. The second sentence had no diplomatic precedent. It was not language the Dracha used in official communication. It was raw, which meant their translator had passed it through without softening, which meant the commander had sent it knowing exactly how it would sound. The second sentence said, "What are those things?" Not a challenge, not a threat, a genuine question from a species that had just encountered a vocabulary it did not have. I picked up my pen. It was a physical pen. I used them because I found the weight helpful when I was thinking. I rolled it between my fingers once. Then I set it down and went back to Form 7C. The Senate called an emergency session at 1400. I attended via comlink because I had a 1500 resource declaration deadline, and the Senate was not going to help me file it. Voshen's voice came through my speaker with the particular tone of a man reassembling a picture he thought he understood. He wanted to know about Kepler 442. He wanted to know about the deployment. He wanted to know about the technologies that the Dracha had encountered and could not identify. I told him, not everything, enough. I told him that the items deployed at Kepler 442 had never been classified as weapons under Resolution 7 Omega because, technically and verifiably, they were not weapons under the legal language of the resolution. They were, under the definitions provided in Annex C, subsection 14, paragraph 3 of the resolution itself, defensive utility systems with secondary mechanical functions. The defensive utility systems had performed their secondary mechanical functions. The spirit of the resolution, Voshen said, and his translated voice had a quality in it I had not heard before, was full disarmament. With all due respect, Counselor, I said, and I said it the way I always said it, the way I had always meant it. The spirit of the resolution is not legally binding. The text is. I saved Form 7C and submitted it before the deadline. The Senate was still talking when I did. Page 47 of the legal brief I sent them the following morning was my favorite. The footnote in it was technically structured as a classical rhetorical syllogism, in iambic pentameter. I had spent 3 evenings on it, and I was not sorry about a single one of them. The emergency hearing convened 16 days after Kepler 442. I arrived early. That was deliberate. There is a particular kind of psychological pressure that comes from being already seated when your accusers enter the room, and I had spent enough years in Senate chambers to know how to use every variable that a room offered. The chamber was configured for judicial proceedings, which meant the central floor was cleared and the delegation seats were arranged in a full ring, every member species watching from equal height. No podium elevation, no spatial hierarchy, just a circle, and in the center of it a table, and at the table me. Colin sat behind me in the secondary advisor seat. He had brought 2 copies of the legal brief, tabbed and annotated. He had also brought coffee in a sealed flask, because we had been here before and he knew how long these things ran. The chamber filled over 40 minutes. I watched species arrive that I had never seen attend a hearing before: minor members, observer species, non-voting affiliates. The Caliph delegation sent their full complement of 12, which they had not done for any session in 3 years. They sat very still in their section and watched the room with the particular attention of people who had a personal interest in the outcome. I understood that. The Yuri delegation was smaller, 5 members, but they had sent their senior diplomat, a woman named Velasha, who was known for sitting at the back of rooms and saying very little until the exact moment when what she said changed everything. She was sitting at the back. She was saying nothing. I noted her position and did not look at her again. Voshen opened the proceedings without ceremony. "Commander Osai Mensa," he said, "the Senate has convened this hearing to address events at Kepler 442 and to determine whether the Terran response to Resolution 7 Omega constitutes compliance or violation. You have been afforded full right of response. Do you understand the nature of this hearing?" "I do," I said. "Are you prepared to answer the Senate's questions directly and completely?" "I am." He looked at me for a moment, that long neck tilt, but different now, not the satisfied tilt of a man with a filed problem, something else, something recalibrating. "Did humanity disarm?" he asked. The chamber was quiet enough that I could hear the environmental systems cycling. I took a breath, not a dramatic one, a working one, the kind you take before you do something that requires precision. "Humanity surrendered every asset defined as a weapon under the legal text of Resolution 7 Omega, I said. Every vessel, system, and device cataloged in the weapons registry submitted to the Senate prior to inspection. Every item Inspector Lanvor's team identified and requested. Every item on the agreed disarmament schedule. In full, on time, with 0 verified violations." Voshen's secondary advisor leaned forward and spoke quietly to him. Voshen listened, then looked back at me. "And the items deployed at?" "Were not on that list," I said. "Because they were not submitted to the weapons registry. Because they did not meet the classification criteria for the weapons registry under Annex C, subsection 14, paragraph 3. Because you wrote the classification criteria. Because a joint Senate-Terran working group drafted the classification criteria over a period of 14 months in open session, with full Senate oversight. Page 12 of the brief. The session records are attached as Appendix 3. He already knew this. He had read the brief. Everyone in this room had read the brief. This part of the exchange was not about information. It was about establishing in the record the shape of what had happened. I had been in enough hearings to know the difference between a question and a foundation. The cross-examination ran for 3 hours. Senator after senator, each one approaching the same territory from a different angle, looking for the seam in the legal architecture where something could be pried open. There was no seam. I had spent 4 years building a structure with no seams. The 15th senator to question me was a Nureli, a species I had always found difficult to read because their emotional register was almost entirely sonic, and my translator flattened it. He was old, by Nureli standards, and when he spoke his voice carried harmonics that my translator rendered as a kind of weighted patience. "How long," he asked, "did humanity plan for this?" Not accusatory, not rhetorical, he was genuinely asking. He wanted to know. The chamber shifted slightly. It was the first question that had not been a trap. I looked at him. "The foundational strategic framework," I said, "was drafted in response to first contact with Senate expansion policy. The original document is dated." I paused. "I can give you the last 2 digits of the year," I said, "if that is useful." He waited. "It was not written in this century," I said. The chamber did not erupt. That would have been easier, actually. What it did instead was something slower and more significant, a collective recalibration, like a room full of people quietly revising a number they had held in their heads for a very long time. The Caliph delegates sat very, very still. The Yuri senior diplomat, Velisha, wrote something on her tablet and then set her pen down carefully, aligned with its edge. Voshen looked at me with an expression his species had not, to my knowledge, ever directed at a human representative before. I did not name the expression. I had a rule about that. At the 4-hour mark, Colin leaned forward and set a small folded note on the table beside my water glass. "Physical analog, old tech." I knew what it was before I read it. I had been waiting for it since this morning. I did not open it immediately. I let the next senator complete his question, answered it cleanly, watched him sit back down with the expression of a man who has thrown a stone into water and watched it go in without a ripple. Then I picked up the note. I read it. My water glass was at a slight angle on the table, a few degrees off from straight. I had noticed it at the start of the hearing and had been adjusting it, absently, every time my hands were free. Left, right, a few degrees, left again. I read the note. I folded it once. I put it in my breast pocket, over my sternum, and pressed it flat with one hand. Then I straightened my water glass. Colin, behind me, very quietly poured 2 cups of coffee. He slid one forward to my left. He held the other. We did not look at each other. The hearing continued for another hour and 40 minutes. When the Senate called the formal vote on whether humanity had violated the terms of Resolution 7 Omega, the result was not close. We had not violated the terms. That was in the record now. Permanent, indexed, available to every member species in the Senate archive. As the chamber began to empty, the Veth ambassador, not Voshen, but the lower-ranking one who had sat beside me at the original resolution passage and told me every species found its place, crossed the floor toward me. He stopped a polite distance away. He looked at the table, at my glass, at the folded brief. He did not look smug. The expression was gone, replaced by something I did not have a word for in any of the 6 languages I spoke. I found, unexpectedly, that I missed the smugness. It had been readable. This new thing on his face was not. I picked up my coffee, drank it, let him stand there with his unreadable expression while the chamber emptied around us, 200 years of galactic order leaving through 8-meter doors. "Commander," he said eventually. "Ambassador," I said. He nodded once and walked away. Colin collected the brief copies and the coffee flask. I gathered my documents. Outside the chamber doors, the carved seals of 200 species looked down at us in the corridor light. I found the Terran seal near the bottom without looking for it. I had memorized its position a long time ago. I did not stop walking. 8 months after the hearing, the Senate had still not found the right word for what humanity was. I knew because I was the one they kept asking. The request came in different forms from different species. The Veth phrased it as a formal administrative inquiry. The Senate required a species classification update for Terran representation tier eligibility. The Drachai phrased it as nothing, because the Drachai had not sent a diplomatic communication to any human representative since. and I did not expect them to any time soon. The Caliph senior diplomat, a quiet woman named Adia Marsh, phrased it over tea in my station office as simply as she could. "What do you want?" she asked. She had been in her role for a long time, longer than me. She had been sitting in Senate chambers when the resolution against her own people had passed. She had signed the compliance documents herself. I knew this because I had read her file years ago, the way I read everyone's file, and I had never forgotten the photograph attached to it, a woman at a table, holding a pen, her hand very steady. "That's a large question," I said. "Yes," she said, "I'm asking it anyway." I thought about that for a moment. "Right now," I said, "I want to finish this tea before my 1400 call." She smiled. It was the smile of someone who understood that some questions get the answer they deserve. I finished the tea. The 1400 call was with Voshen's office, which had been scheduling and rescheduling a framework discussion for 3 weeks. His administrative aide confirmed the meeting time. I confirmed it back. The call lasted 4 minutes. The actual meeting, when it came, lasted 6 hours. Voshen wanted a new classification category. The existing Senate taxonomy had 4 tiers for member species: provisional, developing, established, and senior. Each tier came with corresponding rights, restrictions, and expectations. Humanity had been provisional for 11 years, the longest any species had held that classification without either advancing or being placed under remedial protocol. Resolution 7 Omega had been a remedial protocol. I had walked humanity out of it with the legal brief, but that meant we were back to provisional, which no longer fit, and developing assumed a species was being guided towards Senate norms, which also no longer fit, and established assumed a species had accepted the fundamental structure of Senate authority as the governing framework for its behavior. That one fit the least of all. "There is," Voshen said carefully, "no existing category for a species that is simultaneously compliant with Senate law and operating entirely outside Senate expectations." "I know," I said. "What would you propose?" I had been sitting on the word for 11 years, not the policy, not the framework, the single word that went in the classification field. I proposed it. Voshen looked at it on his screen for a long time. "This is not a standard Senate term," he said. "No," I said. "It implies an ongoing state rather than a fixed position." "Yes," I said. "It implies that the category is not permanent, that it has a direction." "Yes," I said. He looked at it for another long moment. Outside his office window, the Senate station orbited its star in the same slow arc it had maintained for 300 years, carrying the weight of 200 species and the architecture of a galactic order that had been built on the assumption that smaller, newer, less organized species would, given appropriate guidance, resolve into predictability. I had spent my career in this building. I knew every corridor. I knew which elevators were slow and which were fast. I knew which cafeteria served the best approximation of real food and which one served something that technically qualified as nutrition but tasted like ambition. I knew this building the way you know a place you have always known you would eventually have to leave. "I will bring this to the full Senate," Voshen said. "Thank you," I said. I was back on the Terran station by 2000. Colin had left a summary of the day's communications on my desk and taken himself off duty, which I had told him to do 3 times this week, and which he had done exactly once tonight, which probably meant something important was in the summary. I read it. At the bottom was a flag. Incoming transmission, non-official channel, sender classification VETH, Junior Diplomatic Corps marked personal. I almost did not open it. I opened it. The sender was a VETH diplomat named Alvel. I did not know him by name, but I recognized his photograph from the Senate Junior Corps directory. Young, by VETH standards, 3rd-generation diplomatic family, assigned to the Human Affairs Division because his file noted genuine cross-cultural interest, which in Senate HR language meant he had actually asked for the assignment instead of being assigned to it as a consequence of not being assigned to something better. His transmission was text. It said, "Commander Osei Mensa, I recognize that this communication is informal and outside standard protocol. I want to ask you something that I have not been able to ask through official channels. I am not asking on behalf of the Senate or the VETH delegation. I am asking as someone who has spent 3 years studying human affairs and who genuinely does not know the answer. What will humanity do with this?" I read it 3 times. The note from Colin's desk was still in my breast pocket. I had carried it through the hearing, through 8 months of meetings and legal filings and classification discussions, through 6 hours with Voshen today. I took it out now. It was worn at the fold line from being opened and refolded so many times. I read it again. Admiral Grace Nkosi had sent it the morning of the hearing, routed through Colin because she had not wanted it on any official communication log. It was 4 words, not 3. I had misremembered in the beginning because I had been too focused on keeping my hands still to count precisely. 4 words, her handwriting scanned. "Your father would know." I set it on my desk. My father had been a military engineer. He had spent 30 years on deep installation projects that were never in any public record, designing things for contingencies that he never named at dinner and that I understood by the time I was 12 were not the kind of work you asked about directly. He had died when I was 22, 3 months before I got my Senate attaché clearance, which meant he had never known what I became, and I had never been able to tell him why I became it. He had never used the word afraid, not once in my memory. He had a different vocabulary for it, words like prepared, like ready, like thorough. His whole life had been a kind of translation, turning fear into work, turning work into structure, turning structure into the kind of safety that does not announce itself. I had learned that language from him. I typed a response to Auvel. I wrote 4 drafts before I kept one. The final version was 1 paragraph. It said, "You are asking the right question, which is different from asking a question I can answer. What humanity will do with this is the same thing humanity has always done with every position it has ever held: continue. Not expand for the sake of it, not demand for the sake of it. Continue, because the alternative to continuing is stopping, and stopping is a thing humanity has never been very good at. The Senate classified us as a managed species for 11 years. Before that, as a contact stage civilization. Before that, as a pre-contact world. We were all of those things. We are also the thing that survived all of those things. Whether that is reassuring or not is something you will have to decide for yourself. What I can tell you is that the answer to your question is not a threat. It is not a promise. It contains the word yet, which is not the same as the word soon, though I understand why those might feel similar from where you are standing. I read it back. I sent it. I sat for a while in my office, in the quiet of a station that was running night cycle lighting, blue, white, and low. I thought about my father's word for afraid. I thought about Adia Marsh's steady hand on a compliance document. I thought about the Caliph delegates, sitting very still in the hearing chamber. I thought about Velishaz's pen, aligned carefully to the edge of her tablet. I thought about all the species that had signed resolutions and surrendered things they had built and watched their own capacity diminish, year by year, under the careful management of a Senate that genuinely believed it was doing the right thing. I thought about what it might mean to all of them that one species had found a different way through. Not by refusing, not by fighting, by reading the document very, very carefully for a very, very long time. I took out the formal species classification paperwork, the one that needed to go to the Senate registry. It was a standard Senate form, 2 pages, 11 fields, one of them labeled Species Threat Classification. I looked at that field for a long time. Then I left it blank. At the bottom of the form, there was a notes field which most delegations left empty. I picked up my pen, the physical one, the heavy one I kept for thinking. I wrote 7 words. I looked at them. I crossed out the first 2. I looked at the remaining 5. Then I wrote in the notes field in my clearest and most official script, "With all due respect, that is not the right question." I filed the form at 2241. The Senate registry would process it in the morning. Voshen would read it before his first meeting. He would call my office probably, and I would be in a different meeting, and Colin would take the message, and the message would say something diplomatic that meant, "We need to discuss this." And I would discuss it. That was the thing nobody in the Senate had fully understood yet. Through all of it, the resolution, the inspections, the hearing, the 8 months of reclassification talks. They had kept waiting for humanity to stop, to arrive at a position and hold it, to become, finally, the stable and predictable member species that every resolution and protocol and classification system was designed to produce. We were never going to stop. Not because we were hostile, not because we were defiant, not because we had some grand design or destination. Because stopping had never been in our vocabulary. My father had taught me that, not in words. In the 30 years of quiet work he had done in installations with no public record, building contingencies for things he could not name at dinner, translating fear into structure, structure into safety, safety into the kind of foundation that his daughter could stand on when she needed to hold very still in a room full of people expecting her to flinch. I put on my coat. I turned off the office light. The corridor was quiet, blue-white, empty. My footsteps were the only sound. Past the windows, the station's habitation ring curved away, and past that, the star, and past that, 11 light-years of open space back to a blue planet that had just finished handing over the most visible portion of its capability, and had not lost a single thing it actually needed. I walked to the lift, pressed the button, waited. The Senate had ordered disarmament. We had complied. Every word of it. The doors opened, I stepped in. Somewhere on the Senate station, Voshen was probably still awake, working through the implications of a species that did not fit any of his categories and kept filing its paperwork on time with notes in the comments field. Somewhere in the junior diplomatic corps, Alvel was reading my response for the second time, finding the word yet, sitting with what it meant. Somewhere in the deep installations on 4 moons and 1 large red planet, in the maintenance logs of 23 facilities that had never appeared in a weapons registry, 12,000 people who had been categorized as reassigned to colonial support roles were doing exactly the work they had been doing for 8 years. The lift arrived at my floor. I stepped out, walked to my quarters, opened the door. I sat on the edge of my bunk and took the note out of my breast pocket one more time. Your father would know. Yes, I thought. He would. I folded it carefully, set it on the stand beside my bunk, lay down, looked at the ceiling. The Senate would process the classification form in the morning. The notes field would go into the permanent record. With all due respect, that is not the right question. It never had been. The right question was the one nobody had asked yet. Not in the hearing, not in Voshen's office, not in any of the 8 months of careful diplomatic architecture that had followed Kepler 442. Not even Alvel, who had asked better questions than anyone, had reached it. The right question was not what humanity would do with this. The right question was what humanity had always been doing. The answer was the same as it had always been. Exactly what we said we were doing. Reading the document. Very, very carefully. For a very, very long time.